Podcast.
It's Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. David Hooper with you. Bigpodcast.com is the website. That's what you get when you listen, a big podcast. If you do what I'm saying, and I've got some ideas on this episode to help you make that happen. This podcast is about spreading a message, getting people excited about what you're doing, making people listen to your podcast, making people listen longer to your podcast, pay more attention to your podcast, and making you money with your podcast. I've got an example of how quickly things can take off in podcasting. A couple of days ago, this was a Saturday, Dave Jackson interviewed me for his podcast, School of Podcasting, to talk about my new book. You know about the new book, right? 101 podcast episode templates. I've been talking about it. I was on Dave's podcast to talk about it. At the end, I told him, I'm going to remix one of your episodes. Not like a dance remix, but as an example of something I call a sidecar, which is the previous episode that you heard here. It is taking something that somebody has already set up and it is already in motion and attaching something to the side on it. You might think of it like a ride along. Somebody else is doing the work to set everything up. You're there moving forward on their energy. If you didn't hear that last episode, this is how to get it. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That episode is called How to Turn Down Podcast Guest Pitches. It can be difficult, right? You've got a moderately successful podcast, even just a consistent podcast, because people don't do their research when they pitch you. It's not uncommon for podcasters to get 20, 30, 40 pitches per week, and it can get weird if those pitches are from listeners, people who really like you. They want to be part of what you're doing. That's what we're trying to do, right? Sometimes, though, being a guest is not the best way to do that. So I talked about that, basically responding to some things that Dave had talked about earlier. Again, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. If you haven't already gotten that, you'll see it when you do. And it's how to turn down podcast guest pitches. So to take it back to the timeline, I do the interview with Dave on Saturday. The remix episode, the how to turn down guest pitches, that went out on a Sunday. A day later, on a Monday, Dave's interview with me was released on School of Podcasting. Again, that's his podcast. And also on that episode was his remix of my remix. You following this? I'm going to play a few clips for you, but if you want the full episode that Dave did with me, schoolofpodcasting.com. It's episode 838. And the easiest way to get to it, schoolofpodcasting.com/838. Here's the first clip. Check this out.
Mr. Hooper, thank you so much for coming on. I deeply appreciate it. Always great to touch base with you.
Dude, it's the best. It's the best. And I'm going to remix this show too, Dave.
Oh, but wait. That's right. We've got a bonus template. And so this is called the sidecar. And this is probably the most meta thing I've ever done. Dave did a sidecar on his show. Now, what's a sidecar? It's where you play a clip from something and then you comment on whatever the clip is. So I'm now commenting on the clip of David playing a clip of the School of Podcasting, last week's episode with Doc G.
Now, I'll cut out the middle part. That's my remix. You've already heard that. That was the previous episode that I released here. Again, bigpodcast.com/subscribe if you haven't heard it. Then, after Dave plays that clip of me, he comes back in with his own commentary. Here's what that sounds like.
All right, this is future Dave or present Dave. We're lost in the matrix. I don't know what pill I took, red, blue, green. The bottom line is, if you think about it, Dave's audience, David Hooper, they want to hear David Hooper's take on this, and that's exactly what he gives them.
That's where you jump in with your commentary. As far as what Doc G is saying, I'm going to break that down into 3 parts.
Oh, and that's right. I'm going to cut it right there. That's called a tease. And if you want to hear that, go over to bigpodcast.com. I'll put a link right to that episode in the show notes at schoolofpodcasting.com/838. But I really do like the book. I pretty much like every book David Hooper's ever written that I've read. And that's why I like hanging out with the guy. As an author, I do want to put this out there too. If you do get Dave's book, do him a favor and leave a review. That does help on Amazon.com.
So now we've got this thing going on. The audience for Build a Big Podcast, that's you. You've been exposed to Dave Jackson. The audience for School of Podcasting, those guys have been exposed to me. And if you do this right, you can extend this to more than just 2 people. In my book, not the one that I just mentioned, 101 podcast episode templates, but the one before that, it's just called Big Podcast. The black and white one, you can find it at Amazon. There's an audiobook available on Audible. I talk about something I call the Awesome 3. And the Awesome 3 is basically the concept of 3 people getting together, spreading out, and sharing what the other 2 people are doing. Because 3 people, if they spread out, they can be in 3 different places, not just you being in one different place. Also, when somebody else says something nice about you, that sounds better than you saying something nice about yourself. Here's how it works. You go to a conference, you and your 2 buddies, the Awesome 3, you go out, every time you see somebody, oh man, you got to meet buddy number 2. This guy is the perfect guy for what you just asked about. See the next person? Oh, I got somebody who'd be great for that situation. Buddy number 3, I'll introduce you. Then you start seeing people throughout the conference. Oh, hey, come over here. You see your friend, bring him over, introduce him. He's doing it for you. She's doing it for you. You're doing it for her. All of a sudden, everybody knows one of the Awesome 3. And if you do your job right, like I said, when you're walking by, the other person's going to bring you in, or you are going to bring that other person in. That's the basic concept. More information about that, it's in the book. It's called Big Podcast. If you want the direct link to it, bigpodcast.com/book. Let me give you a blueprint to use the Awesome 3 and the sidecar episode together. This is something that you can do on your podcast. You start the conversation with a sidecar episode, meaning that you take somebody else's episode and you start to make it interactive. You bring in your opinion on something they've already said. This is what I did with Dave Jackson. And again, if you want more details, that's in the previous episode of this podcast. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe has it. It's called How to Turn Down Podcast Guest Pitches. It's about that. But as I'm walking through the process of how to turn down guest pitches, I'm also explaining what I'm doing. I'm breaking that 4th wall. But to take it back to your situation, somebody's got something like that you're bouncing off of. You do your episode. Then you bring other people in by sharing the concept with them, and they do their own sidecar episodes. It's much like a roundup post. You've got one specific topic, each person adds to it, but because we can grab these audio samples, we can actually bring these other people into our podcast and they can bring us into their podcast. So we are being introduced to various other audiences and we are introducing other people to our audience. That's the important thing. Each of these people, each of these different episodes, they are bringing new ideas and new people to a brand new audience. So there's great promotion for you here. But if you want to take it one step further, get everybody who's been together for this, turn it into a roundup post on your blog. Get everybody who's been together for this, take those clips, spread them over each of your social media outlets. So not only are you introducing somebody new to your podcast audience, you're introducing somebody new and their concepts to your social media audience. They are also doing that for you. That's what happens if you chop it up. You could release this big interview that you do, or these individual episodes that you're doing in their entirety, or you mix it up, chop it up, whatever you want to call it, do a pod tour kind of thing, like a progressive dinner. Have you had a progressive dinner? You start at one person's house. I'm not a fancy guy. This is how I understand it. You've got an appetizer at the first person's house. You go to the next house. Maybe there's some kind of main dish. You go to the next person's house. There's some kind of dessert. You go to the next person's house. Maybe there's drinks. I don't know. Maybe a second dessert. Maybe go to houses 4, 5, and 6, have a second, third, and fourth dessert. I don't know. But you get the concept. You do one thing at each person's house. You could do the same thing on each person's podcast. Dave actually highlighted this where I teased what was coming up as far as my commentary on that original sidecar episode. I realize this may be getting a little heady, as Dave said, a little meta. It's a podcast about podcasting, but we're reviewing a podcast about podcasting, talking about podcasting. I don't know. You can see how people could get confused. Here is the bottom line for you. The best way for you to spread your message is to get other people involved, other people who have authority, who have influence, who have an audience. Let them introduce you, just like the Awesome 3. They've already got the connections. They've already got the conversation going. Let them introduce you to their audiences. You introduce them to your audience. That is the big concept here. Now, maybe you're wondering to yourself, hey, I've got 5 or 6 people involved. Some of them are not technical. Some of them are not even podcasters, but they've got a big audience. and we're going to do this multimedia thing. How can I get them involved in my podcast on one of these roundtable events? I'm glad you asked. One of the best ways to do it, Riverside.fm. Riverside.fm is the leading platform to record studio quality remote podcasts and video. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I would use it. There is an iOS app, meaning people with an iPhone are good to go. You send a link, you tell your buddy, plug in your headphones or your ear pods or whatever they call them, those Q-tip looking things. You're going to be able to hear me that way, but I want you to hold that phone up to your mouth. That's going to be the microphone that you're going to use. You don't have a studio? Hey, no problem. Just go into a closet full of clothes with your phone. You're listening to me through your headphones and you're talking to me within the built-in mic that the iPhone has. It's not a bad mic. And you do it from a quiet space. It's not going to sound bad, even if somebody does not have any kind of podcasting ability. As I mentioned, if you got a lot of people, you can put them all on one call. Everything is going to be a different track. So it's super easy to mix. You can get those clips for social media. You can mix up your podcast any way you want. Nobody's talking over each other. You're going to love it. So go to riverside.fm. It is free to try. Check it out. They will give you enough free time where you can try this concept without paying, but you're going to like it. And when you join, use this coupon because I'm going to save you 15%. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. That saves you 15% now and forever. Take the free trial, riverside.fm. If you decide to become a member, Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. You recorded your roundup via Riverside. Now what? Obviously, I've got a book. It's called 101 Podcast Episode Templates. Bringing more people into your podcast, though, that's the concept. That's not a template. You can use that for any of the templates that I've got there. You don't even need the book to do this. This is something you can do right now. Go to your two buddies. They're podcasting in a very similar niche to what you're doing. Maybe they're blogging. Mix the media up. It doesn't matter. But do some of this sidecar stuff. Take something, remix it, sidecar it, do a ride along, whatever you want to call it. Take that idea, let them take your idea, build off of it, but introduce their ideas to your audience. Have something good enough to where they want to introduce your ideas to their audience. That's how it works. You got questions? Reach out to me, bigpodcast.com. That's where I am. As I mentioned, you want to get that previous episode from this feed. The way to do that, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. You've heard me say this before, but it's worth repeating. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. I've got 3 buttons there. One for iPhone, one for Android, one is an RSS feed. I don't care how you get your podcast. I've got that option there for you. Go to that page, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Pick the one you want. One button is all it takes. You will be subscribed. You will get every episode that I do for free as soon as it's released. Listen to that last episode that I put out. Again, it's called How to Turn Down Podcast Guest Pitches. If it does not work for you, unsubscribe. No hard feelings. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For right now, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Sign up, see how it does work for you, and I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.